Hi folks, welcome to my 7 hopefully helpful tips video on working in the design window. And the first tip we have here is you only see what you can edit. If you've worked with our templates before, you would open up your web page in Dreamweaver, for example, and you would see a lot of different bits and pieces up at the top, bits and pieces of library assets loaded in from the shared folder, like the header, the menu bar, the logo, things like that. Things you don't actually edit in the page itself. We do have tutorials and instructions that show you how to update those bits and pieces at the top of your page. But for this modification, we've sort of taken that out of the view. And the only stuff you have to edit now is actual content in the page. It makes it a little bit easier to digest what's actually in the page and not get lost in some of the clutter that you would see. All right. For example, if I go back and open up my About page, we have the logo, the text links, the social icons, and we have, in this example, the off-canvas menu button. All those elements are things you would actually edit through your library assets, which is the library shared folder. There we have the website name, the text links, the social icons, and the menu off canvas. Well, there's no use in cluttering up the page at the top with those things because you cannot edit them in the page itself anyways. So we've just hidden them. It makes it a little bit easier to work in the page and digest the content that's there. So let's go back to the next tip. Turn the visual aids off. This is just a preference of mine. When you open up a web page, by default, the visual aids, that's all the lines and guides and things like that will be in place. It shows you what the div containers are and whatnot. I don't think you really need that when you're working with a template page because all that is already done for you. You just need to take a look at the content. So holding down the Control Shift or Command Shift and I keys on your keyboard will turn all the visual aids off and you have a nice clean page to work with. Or you can go to the View, Visual Aids, Hide All, Control Shift or Command Shift and I. The next one is preview your web page first. When I'm building a website or updating a website, the first thing I do, for example, if I'm going to work on the index page, is I select the page, press F12 on my keyboard, or preview in browser. Preview in browser, Firefox. And the reason I do that is because I want to have a page that I can quickly go back and forth with and review the updates that I've made. As I make changes, I just quickly pop back to my page, I hit the refresh button, I see what changes have taken place, and I make sure that they look good. All right. So if you have your page open, you can quickly jump back and forth between the editor and your web browser to sort of see your progress. Because although Dreamweaver includes the live option, the live display does not always display everything, especially when we're adding newer and newer technologies to keep up with newer and newer web standards and web browsers. I'll jump right over to tip number 4. If something doesn't look right, preview it. And that's another reason why I like to preview a web page or the web page that I'm working on. I like to preview it in my browser because occasionally things won't look quite right in the page. I'll give you an example. Images sometimes stretch. It depends if it's a responsive image and different things like that. There's different styles we use to make sure that the things that are in the web page work well for mobile devices. Well, those classes and those styles do not always translate well in the design window. And I would rather that the object work correctly for a mobile device than always display perfectly in your design window. So we try our best to make sure that everything looks as good as it can, but there are certain things that may look a little weird. And those things, well, we're just going to live with because we want to make sure that the content for your visitors works 100%. And in the design window, if we understand that it's not actually a web browser, it's just a design window. It's a glorified word processor really, where you can edit HTML underneath the hood, right? Keeping that in mind, then we can move forward and not get hung up on looking at something that looks a little bit stretched or out of place. Right. I think we've done a fairly good job in representing the content in the design window all as best we can. But when you preview things in your browser, for example, here's our About single page. Let's just preview that in the browser. We'll show it up. You see how we have the animation here? You don't see that in your design window. We have things like font awesome icons and styled headers, etc. bullet lists that are a lot more interactive and look really cool, but when you're working on it in the page, you don't see all of that. And that's simply because the design window is not a web browser and it will not render all the bits and pieces of the CSS or JavaScript as a web browser does. Right, let me jump over to tip number 5, library items and the circle. Okay, this is one of my favorite new updates or changes that we've made to our web pages. And let me just scroll down here in the About Single page as an example. When you hover over what's called a library asset, a library asset is something in Dreamweaver that is loaded in from, basically it's an include page, right? So we have in here our library, then we have a components, a shared, and a sliders folder, and things that are either global, in other words, they're used on all your pages, like your footer, your website name, your copyright, that sort of a thing. Those are all loaded in through the library asset through one of these folders here. Or there are certain components like the project carousel. So let me preview this page and I'll show you. We'll go here. This project carousel right here, this component is a library asset, and the reason it's loaded in from a library asset instead of the code being embedded into the page directly is because it's a lot easier to actually update the asset when it's loaded in through a library file than it is to try and update the code directly in the page. Let me show you why. And one of the really cool features. We can now take a look right here and it shows us the library, components, carousels, projects, and we're using Dreamweaver, so DW, it's the projects.lbi page. That tells us where the asset is being loaded from. So if you want to manually go into your components, into your carousels, into your projects folder, there's the page right there. You can just simply double click to open it, and now everything's labeled nice and neatly, top to bottom. You can just simply double click on an image to bring up your select image source. You can go and select a new image and changes the picture. Then you can change the project name, the description, and that's it. Now, if you were to see all of this in the actual page itself, it would look like a big garbled mess and it'd be very awkward to edit, especially if you're more familiar in working in the design window than you are in the HTML window, right? So to take it one step further, we have, you see the library item here, it's labeled library plugin, projects carousel. It tells you where it's located so you don't have to go and try and figure things out a whole bunch, because once you've updated one or two carousels in the template, you realize that it's the same pattern or same process for all, so it's going to get a lot simpler, a lot faster and easier. But you can also do this. Although you see the circle with the line through it, you can now right click and simply select open library item or detach from original. So if you don't want to have if you want to have a special library item for this page only, you can do that, right? But open library item, boom, there it is. It opens up the library page. You can go ahead and make your changes, and we do have individual tutorials that will quickly walk you through the special, what's required for each carousel, like 20-30 second video just to quickly point out how to update things. But that's one of the really cool features we've added to make it a little bit easier for you to update the different library assets or components that are actually embedded within the pages. One of the simple tips I have here is turn your property panels on. When you're in Dreamweaver, it's very important to have your property panels open down at the bottom right here. And you simply go to the window and properties or control F3 to turn it on. If you turn it off, it gives you a little bit more visible room to work with, but when you turn it on, it gives you a lot more options. And when we're working in library pages or web pages themselves, I like to recommend you keep it on, especially if you are updating anything with hyperlinks. For example, if I open up my menu off canvas library page, which we'll all be updating at some point in time, if we want to update a hyperlink for, say, the About Us page, right, there's our link right there. We have down here the hyperlink tool or the point to file tool. So to update this link, all we have to do is grab our cursor, drag it over to the page we want it to actually link to, drop it, and there it is. It updates the link for us without too much trouble. If the properties panel is turned off, then you'd have to go in code view, and then it's a whole other nightmare. Okay, now one of the last tips I'm going to suggest is using the quick tag selector to edit. And let me explain what I refer to. There are certain things within the template we've added, such as font awesome icons, and you may need to or want to change. For example, in the About Single page, we have this little leaf right beside our header right here, our content header. And you may want to change that leaf to a different font awesome icon. Well, you can quickly or easily do it by going to your About Single page, and we're just going to scroll up here, and we're going to select our, sort of put our cursor right in this area here. Actually, I want to give you a better example than that because that's not styled ahead of time for us. But let me just jump back here and find a better one. I'll cover this in a different tutorial. My apologies. Right up here, let's take a look here because see how this animates right here, animates into the page? Boom, there it is. Okay, so that's a better example because you may want to change that animation effect, right? The leaf doesn't actually have a class to it, so that was a real dumb thing for me to say. So let's go to the H1 tag right here, Meet Bob Smiley. Well, right down here in the quick tag selector bar, you'll be using this quite often if you want to change the classes on or add a class to an existing element in the page. How do we do that? We just simply click on the element we want to change. Down here in the quick tag selector, you'll see it says it should be sort of the first item on the right, right? Then we can simply just right click, do the quick tag editor. You see how it's now highlighted in the entire page up here? And there's the class right there. You see how we have this H1 and data wow, and then a class of wow and fade in down. Now in another tutorial or another tips video, I talk about working with the animation and whatnot, but this is a quick and easy way to access the animation and change it from wow fade in down to fade in. Let's go with up. That's it. So we can now change how this animation works just by right-clicking and selecting the tag. So we'll just do a quick update here. And there it is. Now everything fades up. And that's it for our tips video.